Hello, friends. How are we doing today? I hope we are doing well. I am sorry that I won't get to see you next week, but we will make do with that by talking a little bit about Mary Oliver and a little bit about Ted Kooser. We're finishing up Mary Oliver. How exciting that is. One thing that's amazing to me is I was glancing at someone else's copy of the book, and it looked better than mine. Mine has been well loved over the course of its life. Things are literally falling apart, but it's holding on just long enough to finish the conversation with you. Just a quick thing. Earlier in the week, I posted up a conversation that I had about structuring the order of poems in a collection, and I would love for you to watch that. Take a look at the poems that I've attached with it, and then do the exercise that I've asked for, so we can discuss and think about the way that things can fit together. I've gotten the chance to talk to several of you via conferences thus far in a few different ways, and I want to keep that up. If you haven't signed up for a conference yet, can I recommend highly that you do it for next week? I say that because next week I will be here, no problem, all week. The following week, right after our class, I'm going to be heading out on a plane to Washington, D.C. So I'm going to be at a conference. So I guess the flight technically is going to be Tuesday. So I won't really be able to do much as far as conferencing go, or Wednesday. Won't be able to do much as far as conferencing goes on Wednesday. Thursday, somebody's already signed up. I'm going to try to make sure I fit you in over the course of the conference schedule. But I just want you to know that it'll be a lot easier to get a hold of me that week. The following week, I've got people signed up. That's fine with me. That the last day of the semester officially is that Tuesday. It's weird. I don't fully understand it. But if we're talking throughout that week, I'm fine with that. I guess we're technically then getting into finals week. But again, that's cool with me. We'll fit it all together, and we will make it work. So yeah, sign up for conferences if you haven't. If you have, thanks. If I've already talked to you, whatever, we did it. I don't mean whatever. It was great. Well, let's make sure we can get signed up for next week. Okay. So let's talk about Mary Oliver and what she discusses here in the sections on revision. And revision is a tricky thing, because revision is something that is often seen as less a joy than the act of initiating the process of creativity in a poem. I talk to a lot of students who love writing poems. They love getting that first draft on the page. They love the exploration. They love the unexpectedness of what happens. And then they're kind of content to not do anymore. Because it's like, I wrote a poem, it's good. Now I can write another poem. But I say before we write another poem, let's stick with the one that we've got. Because very unlikely that poem is done. What does done mean in a poem? I don't know. We quoted earlier in the semester Paul Valery, who told us that a poem is never finished, it is simply abandoned. And that makes sense, right? There are times in which our patience sort of runs out on a given poem. But what I want to talk about today is what we do before our patience runs out. How we take a poem that we already like and how do we make it better. And I think there are a few things we can do. And I think one of the first one is something that we've done. That we've shared our prompts, we've shared our workshopping, we've shared it with other people that presumably we trust. We should. I think this has been a fantastic class. I've loved the workshops. I've loved the feedback you've given each other. I think this class is fantastic. So that's one thing, is you find people that you can trust to read your material and give you feedback on it and give you a sense of how certain things are functioning. I think that's great. I think it's also a matter of trusting yourself, of putting in the work. As I said, I think a lot of writers view the creative process of getting a first draft together as not being work. And then they view the process of revision as work. So we see fun and then work. This obviously is a terrible way of thinking about it. Revisions can be fun, and writing a first draft can be work. I mean, these things don't have to be completely removed from one another. So what I want us to think about is when we're writing our first drafts, to go easy on ourselves. And that's what I try to do. When I'm writing a first draft of a poem, I'm under no impression that this has to be perfect. I'm under no impression that it has to be good. It just has to give me something, because it's easier to work when you have something on the page. So when I'm writing a first draft, I've got an idea that I want to get out there, and I'm going to try to get it across. Famously, and you can look this up if you want to, Elizabeth Bishop's wonderful poem, One Art, is a poem that we look at now as a villanelle. It's a perfect, refined, lovely poem. If you find her original version of it, and you can find her typed up original copy with notes all over it, it feels almost like the typed rough draft of this poem is notes in itself. And what I mean by that is it feels like it's a rough outline of the story of the poem, but the magic of the verse within the poem is not there. There was no intention, I would think, of Bishop of feeling like this was done. She wrote a first draft because she had an idea for a poem. She put that draft down, and then she went back and she figured out what that poem was supposed to be. That's how rough draft should work. Rough draft should be an invitation into a world, and revision is figuring out what that world actually is. And so don't look down at revision. I think that a lot of us do that. A lot of us think that revision is just, oh gosh, it's just this thing I have to do, and I don't want to. And sometimes we stumble into Allen Ginsberg, who tells us things like first thought, best thought. Like the best poem you're going to write is the first draft. No, the beats were wonderful. But, if you read through some of the Kerouac novels or even some of the Ginsberg poems, some of them are wonderful. But even the wonderful ones have a lot of things that probably could have withstood a little bit of revision, tightening of the poem. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think like when I read a book like On the Road by Kerouac, part of the Beats who follow this philosophy too, every 15 pages is something wonderful, but the 14 pages in between it just feels like I'm trying to work through it. I like Big Sur, his novel, better, so maybe that one's every 12 pages, and then you get to something really good. So it speeds it up a little bit, but that's beside the point. What's important is that you have to make sure that you are willing to go back and look at something, because the first draft you're looking at with the creator's eyes. The second draft you're looking at from a more practical perspective of what we can do. Let's see what Mary Oliver tells us here on page 109, and hopefully my falling apart book will stay together. Well, you are first able to write on the page whether the writing comes easily or with difficulty, is not likely to be close to a finished poem. I like the way she accentuates this. It's not likely to even be close to the finished poem, let alone be the finished poem. It's probably going to look a lot different. I also like what she says there about whether it comes easily or with difficulty, because this happens sometimes. There are poems that I have written in which the first draft came pretty quickly, and maybe I revised it and it looked different than the original, because it always does, but maybe it didn't feel like a completely different poem, as sometimes happens. There are sometimes when I'm writing a first draft of a poem and it's really, really hard. There's something that I want to do with it, but I can't quite figure out how to get there, and it takes time, and it's a challenge. But I like what she's saying. No matter what your style is at the beginning, no matter how hard or easy, you got to revise that thing. And don't pretend like you don't have to. I think this is an important thing to get into our mindset, is that you just have to. If it has arrived without much effort, so much the better. If it was written with great toil, that does not matter either. I think that kind of happens. I found this in my experience. There are certain poems that I've worked on, and I worked on the first draft, and it took forever, and then I went back and I went through revision after revision, and I never really got the poem quite where I wanted to. And then soon I wrote another poem that came so much more easily and was so much better, even in its earlier forms, and then I revised it and it got better. It's almost like there's a reward from the poetry gods or whatever it is that kind of gives you something if you struggle with something long enough. I don't really believe that's true. I think it's me or you that's creating that. But I think it's important to remember, if it's easy, if it's hard, doesn't matter. You got to revise it. What matters is that you consider what you have on the page as an unfinished piece of work that now requires your best conscious and patient appraisal. Conscious and patient. These are important words here. And I want to talk about conscious, because when you go back and revise your poem, you have to be thinking about it in a way that you weren't in the original draft. In the revision, you have to go back and start looking at things that maybe you wouldn't have thought about. Maybe you just put words in there to fill things out, but now you go back and you want to start looking at every word with some scrutiny to make sure that everything that you've got in there is what has to be there. And if there are things that don't belong there, then you take them out. And this is sometimes difficult. Sometimes it's hard to cut lines that we may have liked in that initial stage of creation of it, but they have to go. This is a weird counterintuitive thought, but sometimes we have to cut good writing to make something better. And that doesn't feel like that should be the case. It feels like if there's good writing in something, I should keep it. Because if it's good, then that must mean that I should keep it there. Because the whole thing will be better as a result. But not always. Sometimes something is good, but maybe it's not good for whatever poem you're working on. Maybe you've got a good line that's going to work in a different poem, but not in this one. You've got to make sure that everything in your poem is in service of whatever the poem is trying to do. And if you have a line that's good, but it doesn't belong in this poem, you cut it and you save it and you put it somewhere else. I have like a Word file that's just filled with lines of poems that I think are probably good, but I haven't figured out what to do with them yet. Sometimes I'll go back and maybe start a poem with one of those lines or phrases and figure out where it goes from there. But it's important to be conscious. You have to look at it almost like it's not your poem at that point. What would you do with this poem if this was turned in by somebody else in workshop? It's really hard to get your mind there because it isn't the case, right? That's not somebody else's poem, it's your poem. But if you can go through it and try to find where those differences exist between what you would do as the artist and what you would do as somebody revising somebody else's piece, it helps. And it takes practice, honestly. And patience. A great poem doesn't necessarily come in an afternoon. Probably some of the poems that I felt best about took weeks and months to get where I wanted them to go. I mean, literally. I had an idea for a poem that I worked on several years ago that I had an idea, and I wrote down what the idea was, and then I started to write down some of the lines of the poem, and it ended up being in sections. I liked it, but I didn't like it enough. I thought of a way of rearranging the entire structure of the poem, which ended up being in service of it. It took me months before I got that poem in a place where I feel it's done. And I haven't gone back to that poem in a while, and it's been a few years, so I might not. And, there are other poems that I've written that I haven't gone through with that level of scrutiny and detail. But I've gone through them. I mean, even the poems that I haven't really spent a lot of time with, I've still spent some. There's some poems that I write a first draft and I look at it again and I say, maybe someday I'll feel like I should go back to this one. And then sometimes I don't. But then there are ones that matter that I do go back to. And it's important to remember that you shouldn't force something into existence too quickly. Be patient. Poetry is a patient form. At least it needs to be. That doesn't mean you can't have lines that accelerate. You can't have poems that speak with energy and rhythm. But don't feel badly if it moves at a pace. The creation of it moves at a pace that is different than what you expected. You can always go back and write something else too. I do that. If I'm working on a poem and I've done all I can with it at a certain point, I go away. And then I try my hand at something else, maybe something that's much different, and see how that works. I think that's something that often feels like a serviceable effort on my part. And she talks about this in the section, some of the things we just discussed. One of the difficult tasks of rewriting is to separate yourself from the origins of the poem, your own personal connections to it. So that's what I was saying in regard to this idea of trying to look at it as if you were looking at somebody else's poem in a workshop. Really hard. Doesn't feel at all natural, but it will in time. Without this separation, it is hard for the writer to judge whether the written piece has all the information it needs. The details, after all, are so vivid in your mind. Sometimes we get so attached to something that we've written that we can't see it for anything other than what we want it to be. I probably have talked to you about this before, but there's a reason why I can write a poem and work on it over and over again and revise it and read it aloud. And then I hand it to my wife and she sees a typo in the first line that I did not see. And obviously in this situation, I grab the poem back from her and I get cranky and I walk away. No, that's not true. But why does that happen? Why does my wife see the poem and the typo in the poem and I didn't? I spent more time with it. I wrote it. I wrote that typo. Why don't I see it? It's because she's seeing it as it is, and I'm seeing it as I want it to be, right? So what we need to do is try to find a way to stop ourselves from seeing something as it's supposed to be and see it as it actually is. And I think that's what often happens in our poems, that we're seeing things as they are supposed to be. We're seeing things as they are idealized in our own minds, but we're not seeing what's literally on the page. And how do we go about doing that? Well, I think sharing it with someone else is a good step. because they can see things that we can't. I think reading them helps too. Reading them out loud doesn't always help, doesn't always work as effectively as we want it to, but sometimes it does. I think that these are all things that are worth trying to do. As we talked about in class before, when you're sending work off to a publisher, it has to be as perfect as it can be. And so sometimes it's nice to have people that you can rely on, who could take a look at it and maybe give you some feedback on what you've got. But it's also important for you to try to distinguish the poem from you. And that's hard, especially if it's something that's super personal. We've all written things that are very, very personal. And when we do that, it's hard to look at it again and think, oh, now I will pretend it's not me, because it obviously is. So I think that's important. And one thing that Oliver talks about, one of my favorite sentences in the book, is the first full paragraph on page 110. I like to say that I write poems for a stranger who will be born in some distant country hundreds of years from now. And then she goes on to say that this is a useful notion, especially during revision. It reminds me forcefully that everything necessary must be on the page. I must make a complete poem, a river swimming poem, a mountain climbing poem, not my poem. If it's well done, not my poem, if it's well done, but a deeply breathing, bounding, self-sufficient poem. So this is interesting, right? So I think that we don't want to get into the habit as a rule of thinking about writing for the masses down the line. I like the idea of writing for people who are in my moment with me. But she makes a really good point. That if you think about it, not from a point of like, oh, I hope I'm anthologized in 200 years. I don't care about that. I'm not going to be here. I guess it'd be cool for whatever future great grandchildren or whomever are out there. But for me, it doesn't matter. I like writing for now. But this idea is, even when you're writing for now, if you include enough in there to make the poem feel complete, like the writer doesn't have to be there to tell you what's going on, then you've got something that's kind of interesting, right? That it's not my poem if it's well done, but a deeply breathing, bounding, self-sufficient poem. A poem that I don't need to tell my reader what they're supposed to think or do with it. And I think that that's important, right? Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't write poems with pop culture or whatever else. I am obviously a major supporter of those types of poems. But I think it's important that even in those poems, that the poems themselves have enough going on that it doesn't feel like they need the assistance of the writer to guide them along. So basically in this section, she talks about how important it is to revise. Cutting, as she says, is an important part of revision. We have to. We've talked about that in class. Sometimes cut a lot. Maybe you put some of it back. Don't get rid of anything forever that you cut. If it's like a significant line or section, I always like to save multiple versions of a given poem so that I can go back to it and think, okay, I did a lot of revision. Did I actually benefit the poem? And then I go back to an earlier version and I think, maybe not. So that's important to do too. The next section that she talks about is about workshopping and solitude. And I think we can talk a little bit about the workshop. We've done it. We're going to continue to do it. There are some of you that have already gotten me poems for our next workshop, and there are a few more that I want some from for that one for. But a workshop can help writers in a number of important ways. Let's look at the possibilities, and this is important. First, a workshop can, and I'm on 112 just to make sure you're keeping up. First, a workshop can, in an organized way, make sure that the members of the group learn the necessary language of their craft. This is what she starts with. This is interesting, right? She is not starting with, the workshop is a place in which people learn to be better writers, that people understand how to revise their poems. That's important. We know that. But she starts off with the language of the craft. And you all in this class have done a really nice job of learning this. That there are things that you've said in workshops that we've done recently that I don't think we would have talked about early on, because I think you're understanding the language. Without this language, useful discussion is difficult and slow. Members of the workshop cannot talk about poems with any ease and specificity. Neither can they read and understand books or articles relating to prosody which if they continue in the creative field, they need to be able to do. So you need to know the language of the discipline. And this should be the case in whatever disciplines we're interested in. We should know how to talk. And the more we read poems, the more we talk about poems, the more you learn this. And this is something really, really useful that a workshop teaches us, the language of how to critique poems. Second, with the use of this common language, workshop members can save each other enormous amounts of times. I mean, years. They meet to support one another's efforts and to encourage each other, but not to encourage bad writing. The general goal of better writing gives each person the obligation to point out in poems offered for discussion what they think works effectively and what they think does not. That's the way our workshops are structured. We start with what works effectively, and then we talk about what does not. And we talk about the what does not in terms of opportunities for suggestions and growth, and I really believe in that. But I want to make sure we're continuing to think about these aspects, that we're talking about what works effectively and then what needs to be worked on. There will be differences in opinions. That's fine. There will be times in which one person says, I think this is great. Another person says, I think it's terrible. And then I'll tell that person, don't say anything's terrible. Be more constructive. And then they'll say it more nicely, and then we'll talk about that. But it's important to make sure that you know as the writer that nothing is necessarily going to be personal, at least it shouldn't be, and that the feedback that is being provided to you is there to make the poems better, to make sure that we've got something that is working more effectively. And on 115, she says, one of my other favorite things in this book, and I love this book, this is on 115, there's just a sentence in the middle of this section, but I'll just read the first full paragraph, and then I'll stop when I get to the sentence that matters so much to me. A writer may give up some rough but unusual fashioning of lines that either can't find favor of the group or is imperfectly done that elicits criticism for its raw execution, though the idea behind it would be something well worth cherishing. What a shame. Here it is. I would rather see an ambitious, though rough poem than a careful and tame poem. And I really want to make sure, whatever you do as far as workshops go, this is the last workshop you do, or if you take a creative writing fiction class with me in the fall, if you're taking another poetry class on a different campus at some point going forward, whatever you do, think about this, that we'd rather see an ambitious though rough poem, and we can substitute ambitious though rough short story too, than a careful and tame one. I agree with her completely. I want to see chances. I want to see daring moves on the page. I want us to take risks that might not work. Maybe they don't. That's fine. What we need to do is take chances. We try something that's ambitious. And I try very often to reach for ambitious moves in my poems. And sometimes I succeed, and sometimes I don't. And that's fine. That's fine. You just do what feels right, and you do what's instinctual, and you take chances. And I've loved how many of you have turned in poems to workshop that are a little bit daring, that are outside your comfort zone. I've seen that so much in the prompts, that I've gotten prompts that are doing things that are very bold and daring. I've got prompts from some of you in which each prompt feels like a different thing, like it's coming from a different place completely. And I love that. So that's what the workshop is. I hope it's felt like that to you this semester. We've obviously talked about it a lot, but I think at this point in the book it's neat to go back to what Oliver's saying and thinking about how we've done and if we've fulfilled these goals, and how as you move forward and do different workshops, and heck, maybe some of you teach them yourself someday, how we use these strategies to improve what we've got. So the last part she talks about here in this section is about solitude. And when I used to work at a bookstore, it's a big corporate bookstore, I worked back when I was getting my master's degree. The initials B and N were involved, but I'll say no more. But when I was working at this store, I was the poet. They had me in charge of the books in the section involving computer and business books, and not the poetry books, because corporate America, but that's fine. Yes, I was the guy at the Barnes & Noble in Spokane, Washington, that if you needed a computer or business book and you wanted a recommendation, you were referred to me. Oh, those poor people. Goodness sakes. Yes, I know so much about computer and business books. Gosh. I had to learn. You do your best. But I was a poet, and I had a few friends that would kind of make playful fun of me. I think they were my friends, and I think they were making playful fun of me, and would say that I was a dark poet. Not really, but I was a dark poet who just sat alone in his apartment in the dark and wrote by candlelight using an ink quill thing. That's not true. But the solitude part, wasn't that far off. I think it's really important for me to write in a place of solitude. And I don't know what your writing style is. We talked about it early in the semester, but I think for me, I like to have quiet for the most part. In my life, that's not always possible because I often end up in a place in which, I have children or I have commitments or I have things that I have to attend to. And my house isn't generally that quiet. My office isn't always that quiet. For these videos, I have to shut the doors, shut my phone off, and all of this to make sure nobody comes in. And there are still videos in which I have used my mad editing skills. I don't know if there are any for our class this semester, but because somebody has come into my office to like clean out my trash can or something. So it happens. I'm waiting for the pause because I figured that would be the cue for somebody to come in, but no. It happens, but I try to my experience, keep things as quiet as I can. I also live a chaotic life, and I know you do too. I know many of your stories and many of your multiple jobs and so many classes, and some of you have children, and just a very busy life. And you just do the best you can. But I understand the importance of solitude, that sometimes as important as it is to work with others, it's often very important to have that time to work with ourselves, to make sure that we really can have time to figure out what it is we need to say. And we do have things to say. You're here in this class because you have things to say. So in the Kuser book, I don't have a ton of time here to talk about this in much detail. So what I'm going to do is actually ask for a conversation to kind of come out of the Kuser book. One of the things that I have liked most in this Kuser book is his emphasis on individual words. And I think the Oliver section in revision kind of talked about this too, this willingness to cut and edit down. And he talks a lot about the different words, thinking about nouns and verbs and how adjectives are not always the most important thing unless they're maybe doing something a little different, and how that well-chosen word can change everything. And I think of the poem he provides on 121, Popcorn Can Cover, by Lorraine Nidecker, who's one of my very favorite poets. And Nidecker's poem, here it is. Popcorn can cover, screwed to the wall over a hole, so the cold can't mouse in. So much depends upon that word mouse, right? If this is popcorn can cover, screwed to the wall over a hole, so the cold can't sneak in, it's an image. It's not bad, it's interesting, but it's that word mouse, right? As Kuser talks about, it contains a lot of creepiness, some squeezing through things, sneaking around. It's a word that in effect contains all sorts of other words. She chose the strongest word, the word that contains the most. And you can't do this necessarily with every single word in your poem. Sometimes we need we need articles and things in our poems. But I love this idea of what it means to choose the strongest word. And so I would love to talk to you, and you can make comments below, about how you choose the most valuable word, how you structure a line most effectively in your poems. So what I want to see from you is talk a little bit about, we can focus on the Kuser. What was something that was in the Kuser book that was especially meaningful to you in this section? What was something that you really took from this section, and why? Maybe it's the conversation about verbs or nouns or the word choices, but share with me like a page number and a quote, just something from this section that was really speaking to you in a profound way. And let's talk about it, and we'll discuss things on the Canvas thread and see what you guys all thought on this. But I really love these sections. We're done with the Oliver book. I hope you enjoyed it. Do you have any closing thoughts on the book? Please share those too. But let's talk about Ted Kuser a little bit more off. Well, it's not offline because it's online, it's on Canvas, but off of this conversation of me talking to you now. And then we'll touch base on things going forward. So I'll be back next week with another video. Make sure that you are watching that previous video that I posted about the order of poems and make comments on that one too, and then do the same thing for this. Thanks everybody, and you have a wonderful, wonderful week.